Hello and welcome to Tech Deals, part 3 of the $1,200 Ryzen 5 1600 computer build video series, Build Time. This video is assembling the computer. Now, if you haven't seen any of the videos in this series, please check the first link down in the video description below to the full playlist. Part 1 is the parts overview, part 2 is the Why vlog, a very deep dive into all the choices and 2 alternative builds for this series. This is the build guide itself. You're going to see this computer overhead in a minute in an overhead shot. We're going to take a detailed look at the inside of it. I'm going to go step by step through the building process. This is designed to be something you can follow along with at home. The next video in this series, part 4, is going to be system setup, everything from the BIOS to Windows installation to overclocking to driver download installation. I'm going to put everything in that video. Part 5 is going to be Windows performance, and then part 6 will be gaming. And at the end, I'll do some nice stuff with it and do a final conclusion and hopefully get some beautiful lit shots with the RGB lights. I'll add some extra lights to it and see if I can't make it really pretty. Now, before we start, just a reminder, linked down in the description below beneath the full playlist of this video series will be the links to all the parts used to both Amazon and Newegg. As I've said before, if you find this video series helpful and useful, please remember to use those when you're shopping. Compare prices at both Amazon and Newegg. Sometimes the parts are less expensive one place, sometimes they're less at the other. Usually, to get the very best deal, you need to split your order and buy about half of the stuff from Amazon and half from Newegg to get the very best deals. Prices change often, so be sure to comparison shop before you buy. Now, before we get started, just as a tease of the RGB stuff, you can already see that the machine is turned on here. Yes, it's already finished. I'm filming this after I finished. But you can see the lights on the front. There are 3 switches on the top here that we can press, and we can change the mode, and we can also change the speed and the color. Here's green, for example. There is blue. These are RGB lights that are included in this case. Now, I do plan in video 7, at least, to do a little bit more detail. I actually want to turn the lights off and show you more. The other thing is this motherboard has light strips on it. In fact, through the back here, I'm not going to turn it now, but there's actually a light strip on the back of the motherboard that is visible through the back of this tempered glass. You can also see a little bit of the reflection of me here. This is more beautiful than I thought it was going to be completely honest with you. The standard side window in computer cases, the plastic or the acrylic, it doesn't really reflect very well and it gets kind of foggy over time. This is sharp as a tack. It is absolutely beautiful. If you are going for a beauty build, this is definitely a case to consider. Now, if you watched part 2 of the video series, the Why vlog, I went into great detail about the pros and cons of that, and I did an alternative build minus all the glass and minus the RGB if you want to save some money. There's an $800 version of this build in that number 2 Why vlog. Be sure to check it out. Now, without further ado, let's take a look at the build. And hello and welcome. Here we are with the parts all laid out on the table. You can see we have the motherboard here inside the case. We'll take that out in a minute. Power supply, graphics card storage, CPU, RAM, and most importantly, our tools. This is a very handy 26-piece VisionTech toolkit with smaller screwdrivers, smaller clippers, and pliers that I use in my builds. It's about $20 or $25. I'll link to it in the video description below. I highly recommend that you have some type of cable tie system. Yes, many cases come with a handful of zip ties, but I use zip ties in my build for cable management, tying things off. I will link to a $5 set of zip ties down in the description below. And then finally, I strongly recommend that you have a number 2 standard Phillips magnetic screwdriver. I picked this up for $3 or $4 down at the local hardware supply store. It's just a basic standard screwdriver, but that magnetic bit makes it much easier to screw in the motherboard and attach components without having the screws fall off. So definitely get one of those. Now, the only preparation work that I have done is to take the glass panels off both sides. You actually need to make sure you do that. I left the one on the front because that's not going to be a bother. But if you see, you can see the desk all the way through here. So take both glass panels off. And if you have a different case, if you're working with something without glass panels, still take both sides off. You're going to need to access both sides when you build. Now, the first thing to do is to prep our work surface. The power supply was here mostly just for the intro to the video, so I'll take it out of the way. And we don't need the graphics card. Not yet, anyway. Normally, you would just do this next to the case, but I'm going to move the case so I can put the motherboard out and we can take a look at it first. Here you can see we've taken the motherboard out. Make sure that you have it on a surface that's not going to be damaged. Of course, I have a cloth here on my desk, but the bottom of the motherboard does have a number of things protruding from the bottom, so don't place this on a hardwood surface without something underneath. Inside the box is actually a piece of padded foam, and you can place it on that if you want to. Before we actually put the motherboard into the system, we're going to do several things. We are going to install our M.2 solid state drive here. It's simply easier to do it here than when it's inside the case. We're going to install our CPU, and we're going to mount our cooler. Now, there are reasons to do this in a different order. If you are using a liquid cooler, for example, you would set up the mounting brackets, which may actually involve removing these. There are 4 screws right here. Some kits bolt through the board, and you would simply undo these screws, take off the back plate, which is behind here, and you would put on the back plate that comes with the liquid cooler. Other liquid coolers will actually clip onto these 2 clips right here, and you would leave these in place. These 2 clips are the older AM3 style cooler. If you are using an older cooler, it may clip onto these. If you're using a newer style cooler, and we are, the Wraithspire cooler is a newer, we're actually going to screw it through these holes, but we're still going to use the back plate provided because it provides the place to screw it into with the Wraithspire cooler. And this is now where our VisionTech toolkit is so handy. If you look at the small screw on top of the M.2 cover here, the standard Phillips size screwdriver is way too large for that. It's useful for other things, but it's too big. We need this much smaller screw. This is a number 1 Phillips screwdriver that comes in this VisionTech kit. And because it's magnetic, it makes it much easier to work with. With that screw removed, lift up the M.2 shield. Now, not all, you may have a different motherboard. Different motherboards are going to have a different type of arrangement. Some have no cover on them whatsoever. Others have an M.2 shield. Some of them are actually under a plastic plate here. You have to look at your individual board and see how they're mounted. Now, this board comes with the posts pre-mounted on the board. You can see one down here in the bottom M.2 slot and one here in the top M.2 slot, but it is in this position. We need to actually move it here because if you take a look at our Crucial MX300, you'll see that it's longer than that is. It would fit down here, but you should really put it in the top slot. To undo this, just use your fingers and unscrew it. It's finger tight, there we go, and we'll simply put it down into the next hole. That's all there is to it. Just make it finger tight, it doesn't have to be too tight. Be aware that there is protective plastic film on this M.2 heat shield. You actually need to remove it. There is a clear plastic tab right here, and you can see we've removed the cover. To install an M.2 drive, it's very simple. Simply take the golden fingers, line them up with the slot right here, come in at a slight angle. This does not take a lot of pressure, it just slides right in. It is really that simple. I'll take it out, I'll slide it in. This does not require a snap or a click or anything. It goes in that easy. And then it simply gently pushes down. You'll see it lines up with that screw hole right there. Because we have this M.2, if we didn't have the M.2 shield, we'd just put the screw directly on. Because we do, we just make sure it's pushed in all the way gently, and then we simply lower the M.2 heat shield. There we go. And then we're going to put the screw back in place. And there we go. It's now in place. This is finger tight. This does not require a lot of pressure right here. I mean, I'm literally just using 2 fingers. Do not over tighten these screws. Those are very fine, very thin threads. You're not trying to secure Fort Knox here. You're simply trying to make sure that it's not going to fall out. Putting our smaller screwdriver down, we will need our larger screwdriver for this. We need to remove these 2 clips right here because our Wraithspire cooler does not use them. It is as simple as taking your standard number 2 Phillips screwdriver and undoing these screws. They are longer than you might think. Keep unscrewing, it will come out. And there, if I keep it from falling off, you can see how long these are. Take all 4 out. And there we go. With the last one removed, we'll set those aside. Put these plastic clips and those screws into the cooler box. If you ever need them, if you upgrade to say the Wraith Max RGB cooler, you'll need this because that's actually a clip-on style cooler. These simply lift straight off. They just sit there. So it's only the screws holding them down. Save these in case you need them for the clips in the future, because otherwise you'll have no way to attach a different style cooler. Maybe you upgrade coolers in the future and that wants a clip style cooler, you'll need these. Save these and the screws. Here you can see the 4 screw holes where those 4 screws were attached. There's a back plate underneath this motherboard. If we were installing a liquid cooler such as a Corsair H100i V2, we would actually push these through and take the back plate off because it uses its own back plate. But we're going to leave it on because the Wraithspire cooler uses it. But just be aware that those actually come off and the whole back plate comes off from behind the board if you're installing a separate cooler. To install our CPU, take a look at the socket. There is a lever right here. This is called a zero insertion force socket. You are simply going to lift this lever up till it's standing straight up. It actually moves the holes. These holes grip onto the pins on the CPU. Be very careful. If one of those pins break, you could very well end up with a non-functional CPU. So in the down position, you can see if I can do it this way on camera. Do you see the holes move? You set the CPU in place. You do not push it into place. It's called a ZIF, or a zero insertion force socket, for a reason. There's no pressure. If you have to use pressure, it's not lined up right. Be aware that one corner is not like the others. This has one pin cut out, the others are at a diagonal. The CPU only goes in one way. We will take our Ryzen CPU, keep it in this protective case that it comes in. This is exactly how it comes in the retail box before you actually install it. Once you're ready to install it, lift this up, grab the CPU by the edge. Do not touch the pins. If you look here, you'll see there's a lot of pins. Each one of those has to be straight. If you look at the bottom of the CPU, you'll see a triangle on one corner where there's one pin cut out. That's the part that goes right there. You simply place the CPU on the socket, lining it up, and just like that. I simply set it down and it fell right into place. There is now no gap between the socket and the CPU whatsoever. You can see it's firmly into place. We simply lower our lever. This takes very modest pressure, nothing major. We just push it down, just like that. If that takes a lot of pressure, something's wrong. That was absolutely not much at all. Our CPU is now firmly in place. Now we need to install our cooler. Now if you have installed your cooler previously or removed it, you will need to apply thermal paste. You can buy tubes of very good MX4 thermal paste for about $5 or $6 on Amazon and Newegg, but you don't need thermal paste the first time you do it. There is pre-applied thermal paste on the bottom of the cooler that's included in the box, which I have right here. And here you can see I've taken the cooler out of the box. This is a brand new Wraith Spire that I've never used before. I have several of them because I have several CPUs. But I'm using a brand new one because I want to show you what it looks like when you first take it out of the box. Make sure that you do not touch the thermal paste on the bottom of the cooler. There's a piece of plastic in the box that protects this. You do not need to install your own thermal paste. This will work just fine. If you ever remove the cooler and you want to reapply it, you'll need new thermal paste. You'll need to clean both the CPU off and the thermal paste off. It's just a little bit sticky. You can just take it off with a tissue or a Q-tip or a small rag. Just obviously don't use anything that you care about. And then you would need to put a small daub of thermal paste on the CPU and then put it back on. I'll cover that in a separate video. But for now, what we want to do is take a note of the 4 screw holes here. You can see the 4 screw holes here. You can see the 4 screws here. These are standard Phillips head screws. What we're going to do is we're simply going to place these 4 screws into those 4 holes. It'll be offset, it'll be on top of the CPU, but not touching it until we screw it down into place. Make note of your power cable. You will need to make sure that this reaches your power connector on your motherboard. We have one right here, we have one right here, and one right here. We're going to use this one right here. So I'm going to install the cooler this way, and this way I can put the power connector right here for the cooler right there. Thinking about it for a minute, and this is an important thing, I'm actually going to put this here and I'm going to connect it like this to keep this cable away from the system RAM. So this is the sort of thing about measure twice, cut once. Think about what you want to do and where you want your cables to go before you install everything in your computer. We now take our number 2 Phillips head screwdriver. We do not screw each of these screws in all the way. Do it about halfway, just a couple of turns, and then go diagonal to secure it down there. And then come across, and then diagonal again. And you're just tightening each screw a little bit at a time, going in a cross pattern. The idea here is to apply the thermal paste evenly. The idea here is to apply force evenly across the CPU. You may find that one of the corners is a little bit reluctant to go in as the cooler is pressing against the CPU. You may have to push down, as I just did a minute ago, on the corner to get it started. You can look down on the side. Actually, the camera can't see it, but you'll be able to look down on the side and see that the screws are actually going into the threads. Do not over tighten. When these reach the end of their thread travel, it stops pretty firmly. There is no need to force these in. Once the threads go all the way down and the screw goes all the way down, the stop is pretty firm. Just make sure that your cooler is on securely by just giving it a gentle wiggle. We're just seeing that it doesn't shift left and right, it doesn't rock side to side, it doesn't rock up and down, because we want it to have firm pressure. So all 4 of our screws are in place. We're going to put this in here. Now I may rearrange this here later, but I'm plugging this in now so it makes it easier to install on our board. I may end up zip tying this to the power cable that plugs in here that's what we have the zip ties for, but for now, that does the job. Our CPU is installed, our cooler is installed, our M.2 drive is installed. You could install the RAM right now, but I'm actually not going to. It does fine installing that in the case, and it does create something else to catch on when you're putting it into. So I'm now going to take everything off the table, and we're going to put the computer case back up here. With the case back up on the table, now there's a couple things we need to do before we install the motherboard. Now we are installing a full-size ATX board, and if you are using this case, you don't have to change any of the posts. You will notice that there are pre-installed posts in the standard ATX configuration right here. If you are installing one of the micro ATX boards instead of a full-size ATX board, notice this mounting hole right here. There's an A and an M next to it. That stands for micro ATX. You will not use these bottom three posts, and you may just want to simply remove one. You'll need to put a post mount right here in order to secure the bottom end of a micro ATX board. But honestly, if you're buying this case, I really think it should have a full-size ATX board. You're buying a very nice case. If this is not your case, if you decide to buy a different case but you're still following along, some cases do not come with these pre-installed. They will be in a plastic bag or a box or a kit with your case, and you'll actually just have to screw them in. They just screw into place. Most decent cases will be labeled which connectors are the ATX. A is going to be for ATX, M is going to be for micro ATX, and some of them will have an I for ITX. Now, don't put your motherboard in yet. We need to put this in place. This is the I/O shield. This is for the back of the case. Now, you want to line it up so that the bottom is towards the bottom of the case, and the label side, of course, goes out. This installs from the inside of the case going out. There's actually a ridge here that will clip into the case. The nicer boards, such as this one, actually have a RF shield built into it. Some of these are just flimsy metal, but this one actually has some padding in it, which is actually quite nice. To install this, I'm going to turn the case up so you can see it. And here we have it. You simply come through the back, and now you probably would not do it this way. Do it on the side if you want, but it just comes in and you just put pressure. 1, 2, 3, 4. And it's securely in place, and that's not going anywhere. So that's what provides you the ports. Every motherboard comes with a different one of these. This does not come with your case. As you can see here, Gaming Series from MSI. So if you change motherboards, you'll need to pop this out. You just simply lift one of these lips up and push through, and it pops right out, and you'll just need to replace it with your new board. I mentioned before that every case comes with some type of package of screws or other accessories. This actually was mounted, and if you watched the previous video, you saw it there. This was mounted in one of the 3.5-inch drives in the back. And when you open this up, all that you'll see inside is a bag with a variety of things. But we need this because we need the screws. The motherboard will mount here on all of these posts, but this has the screws necessary to screw it in. So I've counted out 8 of the screws from the kit. I've placed them right here. We're now going to take our motherboard. Be aware that when installing this, these have to go in first. It goes in at a bit of an angle like this because you've got to push these ports through the holes on the I/O shield first. So essentially it goes down at an angle and then gently comes down, not at a lot of angle, maybe a 20-degree angle, but it comes in first because you need to clear these mounting posts. Now this particular case has a peg instead of a screw hole in this middle position. That will come through this middle hole on the board and actually hold it in place and make it easier to install. I like it when they do that. It does make it a bit easier. So while trying to get this on camera, I'm going to come down here and insert this through the holes. There we go, just like that. That really was pretty easy. So all of the holes of the power connectors and all of the adapters, ports and plugs in the back are lined up. And then the peg is right here in the center. Now we do need to screw our other 8 screws in here, and this is where your magnetic screwdriver comes in really handy. This is where it's not going to fall down into your case, and you can just screw them in. Now please do not screw these in completely until they're all in. Do them halfway. One of the biggest things about assembling stuff like this is to do things in a round robin or cross pattern fashion. I'm putting each of these in loosely. I am not tightening them. So I did these 2 over here. I'm now going to come over here and do this side because alignment is the biggest issue. Now, in a quality case like this, it's not going to be as big of a deal because these things are so well built. I've worked with some cheap cases, and trying to get motherboards into cheap cases can be a real pain in the neck sometimes. The holes don't line up, the case isn't quite square. Especially some of the $30 cases I've done in the past, I've not been very happy with. This screw hole here, definitely the magnetic screwdriver makes so much easier because there is no access back there whatsoever. And now I'm just going around and tightening them once all 8 are in place. Now I say 8, and that's important. The number will be different from motherboard to motherboard and mount to mount, case to case. Because of this peg, we didn't need 9. Some cases don't have that, and you'd actually use the 9th screw right there. And with those in place, our motherboard is securely mounted. That's not going anywhere. I would like to draw your attention to the memory modules now. If you look at the manual, it says here's the recommended order for installing them. And there is actually a silkscreen label right on the board that says first. In other words, it wants you to install, if you're only installing 2 memory modules, it wants you to install them in these 2 slots, not these 2 slots. Yes, it might technically work if you do it the other way, but when they go to the trouble to print one of these and they go to trouble to print it on the board to install them there first, why argue with them? If you take a look at our memory modules, you'll see that they are different on each side and the notch in the center is not in the middle. These do not install either way, they only install one way. And if you look at the length, you'll see that the notch on the board in each slot is further down. So the memory modules are going to install this way. DDR4 memory modules go straight down and straight up. They do not tilt at an angle, they don't go like this, they just go straight in and straight out. There are tabs on either end here. Now this differs from board to board. Some boards only have tabs on one end that move, but this board, and I like this, has tabs on both ends. You're simply going to push those tabs down. You're going to line up the memory module with the notches, and you're going to simply push down until it clicks twice. As simple as that. You'll take your second memory module. Now, the printed circuit board here on each edge slides into the 2 notches on either end of the memory slot. Simply slide that in just like so, and 2 clicks. Memory's done. It's that simple. The next thing we're going to do is turn this over on its back and install our hard drive. Here we have a nice close-up look at the back of this case. This is the LED controller for the RGB lights. 3 cables here are plugged into the 3 fans on the front. There are 3 more plugs. If you wanted to buy 3 more Corsair RGB fans, you can put 2 on the top and 1 as an exhaust fan if you want. Anything that conforms to the spec will plug in there. Off the top of my head, I don't know if other companies make RGB fans that plug in here, but if you want to be safe, just buy Corsair fans because they'll work. This here is our mounting points for our 2 2.5-inch solid state drives, and here are our mounting points for 2 3.5-inch hard drives. You have an additional set of controls right here for the LED lights, but you don't have to use this. This is, after all, kind of hidden. There's actually buttons here on the top of the case I'll show you at some point so you can see what that looks like. I mentioned the backplate before. This piece of metal right here is the backplate that comes with the motherboard, and that's what those clips were screwed into, and that's what's currently securing our Wraithspire cooler. This black metal piece actually comes off, assuming it's not screwed in, and it would be replaced with a different backplate if you're using, for example, a Corsair H100i V2 liquid cooler or some other cooler that comes with its own backplate. But if you're using the Wraithspire cooler, then you're going to keep that. I mentioned during part 2 of this video about the cable management strip. You can see this right here. You can also see that there's 2 screws right here that you can use to disconnect it. You can see a bunch of wires running into it right now. These wires are running under here. The beauty of this is your power supply goes down here. If you're building in this nice, beautiful case, how are you going to keep all the cables from making it ugly? Remember, there's tempered glass here. This is all visible and exposed when the computer is built and turned on. So cables here matter just as much as they do on the other side, and that's what that's for. Now in this build, the $1,200 budget, there is nothing going into these 2 bays right here, only the 3 terabyte hard drive. The astute among you will have noticed these 2 SSDs sitting here. I'm going to be putting them in. They're not part of the $1,200 build, they're because I want them for the machine. When I put this machine together and get everything set up, I actually want more storage, and so I'm going ahead and adding it during the build video. Here you can see our first solid state drive, one of the Kingston drives from my recent Which Solid State Drive video should you buy? Yes, it's on the recommended list. Now you can put it this way or this way. It's going to change how the connectors go in. But since this side is visible, if you want to make it a beauty build, put it label side up rather than having that label there. Installing these could not be easier. Pull this tab over and simply slide it into place. That's it. Easiest installation ever. Take your other solid state drive, making sure that the power and data connectors are facing out, and simply pull this tab back and slide it in as well. How does it get any easier than that? Now here we have the 3TB Seagate Barracuda hard drive, or whichever hard drive you choose to install in this system. Now, because of the lip here and because of where the screw is, it actually has to go up this way. I would prefer to install it this way and put the cables out of the way, but that's how it's designed. If you put a second drive up here, just be aware that you'll need to get power up to this point. Because of the design of this tray, it will not mount in this orientation, so it has to mount that way. So I'm going to put the drive down here. There are tool-free knobs right here, but you'll simply have to bend this out in order to get them in. It's not as nice as this, unfortunately, but you can take this whole tray out if you want. You simply unscrew it here and put it in, but I'm going to give installing it here a try. Okay, scratch that plan, that didn't work. So undo the one screw, take it out, and then you have the tray. It's much easier to get this in place. Now it is true that you can actually take these knobs out. In fact, you could even screw the drive in if you want to, but the rubber mounts do offer the benefit of having a bit of noise isolation. Make sure that you've got the power and data connectors in the right spot. And then let's see if I can get this on the first try. Oh, that's much easier. There we go. And that's mounted securely into place. I messed with that for several minutes before I went, that's entirely too much trouble. Notice the tabs right here, when it goes back in, it slides right there. So we're going to line that up and make sure we slide it back onto the rails. And we take our screw and screw that back into place. As a random thought, I don't know if anybody sells black hard drives that are actually not silver, but for a build like this, who watching can tell me what's wrong with this picture? I just realized that the glass is not going to go back on this side because this drive is designed to be installed upside down. I'm going to leave this in here because this is a perfect example of how it's easy enough to make mistakes, but if you check and double check your work, they're easy enough to fix as you go along. Well, that looks a whole lot better. If you ever put your computer together, make a small mistake, have to go back and change things and think, oh, does this happen to anybody else? I've built hundreds of computers in my lifetime. It's always a learning experience. Don't feel bad if you make a mistake, just fix it and move on. As I stand here looking at this computer, I'm going to make an impromptu change. ADATA is not going to be happy about this, but they'll live. I'm going to take this out. This is a 512 gig SSD, but I don't like the blue label sticking out like that. With glass on the back for a beauty build, sorry, that'll go in something else. I'm not getting rid of it. I'll use it in another computer. I actually just went upstairs and grabbed a 500 gig Samsung 850 EVO. Look how much nicer that looks. From an appearance point of view, yeah, that looks much nicer. Not to worry, ADATA, you'll get used in another build, just not in the RGB build because of your blue label. You could peel the label off of the drive, I suppose, if you wanted to, but it's easy enough for me to go grab another drive. I would like to also make a point. I just swapped out an ADATA SU800 with a Samsung 850 EVO. They're both roughly 500 gig drives. During my which SSD should you buy video, I made the comment that the 10 drives I recommended were so close in performance, you'll never notice them in day-to-day. I just went and changed 2 drives out because I actually don't really care which goes in here. I meant what I said in that video. Now the benchmarks say that the Samsung 850 EVO is faster than the SU800, and maybe I could use this for a boot drive for another machine. I actually really don't care. I meant what I said. The performance between all of those SSDs is so close to each other, buy the one you prefer. As far as I'm concerned, they really are interchangeable. The next thing we need to install is our power supply. Now that is going to be challenging for me to put on video due to where my camera mount is and where this is. I may end up just putting it in there and simply showing you the end result because it's on the other side of the desk, and this is going to require some finagling to get it in. I've now got the power supply in my hands here. I've taken it out of the box. You can see the back here, which will go through here, and you can see the fully modular connectors, which we will plug things into once we put it in. Now, this particular case, the label almost doesn't matter because of that cover and the light that blocks it from that direction. But on this side, it will be visible. Yes, the label does go that way, which is upside down. Turning the power supply over does not change that. Now, the fan could technically be placed facing down, or it could be placed facing up. There are grill holes here. Traditionally, I place it down. There is an air intake on the bottom of the case, and there's an air filter, which you can actually pull out right here to clean, to give fresh, clean air into the power supply. And there you have it. Our power supply is now installed. I really couldn't put that on video with how I had to move it around and get around, but basically there's 4 screw holes back here. Simply put it in, line it up with the 4 screw holes, and screw it in. It is pretty straightforward. Now with a case like this, now we really have to think about cable management with power cables coming out of here, because we need the 24-pin main ATX power connector for the motherboard, which is roughly, actually it's right here, you can see the connectors on the back of the board. So it's probably going to go through this grommet hole right here, bringing it up the cable management tunnel through there. Then we also have an 8-pin CPU power connector up here at the top, which I'm hoping we can run up here through the power management and across the top. If the cable is not long enough to do that, then we'll have to run it up here and simply zip tie it to the connectors on the back of the actual motherboard tray right here. Here you can see I have the 8-pin CPU connector. Since it has the furthest to go, we're going to do it first. The short ones to the drives are easy. Put those in place after you've done the hardest. I wish to make another point here. Several people asked, why are we spending $115 on a power supply? Why wouldn't you use a $60 power supply? Well, if you're in a $180 tempered glass case like this, the fully modular system makes cable management so much easier. You can run them one at a time, tie everything off so it's beautiful. As I said in part 2, the Y vlog, if you're going with a $50 or $70 non-tempered glass case, or this is black on the back, this is not as necessary because then you can just shove all the cables back here and not care. But remember, we need to make our build attractive on this side as well as the other side. Now, taking our 8-pin CPU connector, just looking at the length here, that's already not going to work. There's no way in the world we are going to run this through this management channel and actually get it up behind here and through. There's actually a space here in the motherboard tray which you may or may not be able to see. So what we're going to do is we're going to plug the cable here, and actually we're going to run it this way, up the back of this, we'll zip tie here, and it will run through this hole and plug into the motherboard. You can now see that I've got the CPU power connector in, and I have it zip tied right here. This is where our toolkit also comes in handy, although you could use scissors or anything else for this. We simply take our clippers and we cut off the excess. Important to do, not to leave those things lying around. We will plug that cable in when we flip the machine over to the other side. The next thing is to take our 24-pin ATX cable. This is our big one. This side with the 2 connectors goes into the power supply. This side with the 1 connector, which is actually 2, it's a 20 plus 4, is going to go onto that side of the board. So we're going to take this off to run this cable. Here you can see the plate removed, and you can see how many wires were already being hidden by it from all the components already included. The USB ports up here at the top, the LED lights, the headphone jack, the power jack, and so on. You can now see our 24-pin power connector is plugged into the power supply, and I've actually run it up to this top hole. In between the cut there, I actually looked and tried to decide which one to run it through based upon the position. We're starting off with this one. I may have to change it, but I'm hoping that that is going to work well based upon what I saw. Sometimes cable management in these systems is a little bit of trial and error. You got to play around with it and find something that works for you. And of course, it also depends on how many other connectors you're running. The next power cable I'm going to run now, and I'm not putting this back on yet because we'll need it again, is a serial ATA power cable. We need power to this drive and we need power to these drives. Now, if you're not putting one in here, of course, don't hook them up, but I'm going to have to. This is why I'm installing these drives with this build, even though they're not part of it, because it's so much easier for me just to do it now than to come back and take it apart and do it later. This is another selling point of M.2 drives. The Crucial MX300 I installed is a SATA drive. It's no faster than if it was a 2.5-inch version, but how much easier is it to just plug that SSD into the motherboard than to worry about power and data cables here? Here you can see I have the first SATA power cable plugged in. I've plugged the 2 SSDs into the far ends of this cable. I'll show you why in a minute. And then the other end in here. This is not long enough to provide power to both of these drives and the hard drive off of a single cable. You could use an extender, but because of the angle of the power cables, because of what it has to get through, I'm going to have to use 2 of these to provide power to these separately. Again, tempered glass case, this is going to be ugly. If we just shove this back here, it's not going to be very pretty, so I'm going to do my best to wrap it up. And there we go, that's tied off about as well as I'm going to bother with at the moment. This sort of thing falls squarely into how much time and effort do you want to spend to make it as pretty as possible. Now I have my second SATA power cable, now I'm going to run it to here. Our SATA power cable for the hard drive is now installed. Notice it is not long enough. If we had a second hard drive installed here, it is not going to reach. If you think you might install another hard drive up here in the future, it might be worth pre-running a cable, both A, so you don't lose it, and B, so it's just in place with the cable management. If so, you would simply plug this in here, run it up along here, and simply tie it off up at the top. So if you go to install another drive, you already have the cable in place and you simply need to plug it in. I would also recommend doing the same thing with the data cable. Pre-run a data cable, or maybe tie it off on the end of this zip tie and simply leave it up here so that you don't have to go hunting for it in the future. And I've just put a small zip tie here to take up this loose so it's not flopping around. I left myself enough room to play with it with cable management, trying to make it reasonably nice looking. This right here is yet another reason why we're using this power supply. Again, the comments beneath the first video were, why aren't we going with a $50, 600 watt, 80 plus bronze power supply from Corsair or EVGA? The ketchup and mustard colors. You would have ketchup and mustard colors here, all over the place. Yes, some of those do have black sleeves, but they are not black cables. They are ketchup and mustard underneath the sleeves. And these are flat, making it a bit easier to run, although the connectors kind of get in the way. So if you are doing a tempered glass case, get a decent power supply. But again, if you're not, then it doesn't matter. Now we need data cables for our SSDs and for our hard drive. Please note, if you're installing more than one, the cables that come with many motherboards, this is what they look like. Hopefully the camera can see that. I'll hold it over here. On one end, both of them are straight. On the other end, one is straight and one is curved. But based upon where these drives are and the ports on the motherboard, I want all straight cables. I actually can't use half the cables that come with this board because of that connection. Thankfully, I have extras, but if you don't have extras, be aware that some of these cables may not be suitable due to that 90-degree turn. I have now run my two SATA data cables here. I've zip tied them in two places and they're running through this grommet from the bottom to let me reinstall the cable management. Now for the data cable for the hard drive. And now our cable management is back in place. You can see I have the bar back in place. There was no way I was going to film that. That took several minutes of finagling, rearranging the cables, getting them straight, putting the Velcro straps over them. You're just going to have to take some time with it. Take 5 or 10 minutes, get it done right. Your system will look nice, it'll run right, and now we can flip the system back over to the other side. Just as one quick side note, normally this is the part where I say, put the cover back on because we're done with this side, but it's glass, so we can't do that. Don't put the glass back on until you're ready to stand the machine up and you're completely finished. And now here you can see we have our system turned right side up. Time to start plugging some cables in. The first thing we're going to plug in is our 8-pin CPU power connector right up here. And here you can see that complete. There's no way to film that due to its location, but basically you simply wrap the cable around. It only goes in one way. The next big cable we're going to install is our 24-pin ATX connector. Caution, the mounting hole for the motherboard here and here is the only thing providing resistance when you plug it in. This is a lot of plastic plugs to plug in there. Sometimes these go in really easy, sometimes they don't. The plastic shape of the connector and the plastic shape of your power connector are sometimes just a bit different. When you push down, you're pushing down and bending your motherboard because there's nothing behind it. I strongly suggest that you put one of your fingers here and provide reinforcement to the actual board itself. So I have seen motherboards cracked before, pushing down too hard and in between these 2 points. So be aware of this, be gentle, and provide some reinforcement for the back of this so you're not pushing down and trying to stress too much on your motherboard. And now our connector is in place. Notice I took the RAM out. In order to get behind here and have some leverage, I had to take the RAM out. I probably shouldn't have put it in earlier. Don't be afraid to make adjustments like taking the RAM out if you need to in order to do this. By the way, to take the RAM out when it's installed, you simply pop both of the connectors open on either end and it just pops the RAM right out, slides out, no big deal. There is a plastic tab right here. Same thing on the 8-pin connector. The 8-pin connector goes in really easy. This is tougher. Make sure that this is actually connected. It's very easy to put the power connector in place, but not really put it down far enough to actually have it clip. It should clip on so that you can't pull it off. If you put this on just a little bit and it's not clipped, you move the computer over time, this can work out. In the middle of using your computer, the power connector can actually slide off. I have seen that happen before, not recently, but I've seen that happen before on a machine that didn't actually have it pushed all the way into place. So make sure that you're pushing on both sides of it. Make sure that you got your fingers under to reinforce the board and just work it down one end and the other slowly until it's in place. Take your time. Do not rush that. Now we are going to connect our serial ATA connectors. Be aware that different boards have different restrictions if you install an M2 drive in one or more of the sockets. I have the motherboard manual here, and I've turned to the page that has a table, and most of these boards will have a table that says if you put drives in certain combinations. Here's the M2 slots, there's M1 and M2. If, for example, you install a solid state drive in the first bay and a PCI Express or an NVMe drive in the second bay, then you lose a port. You lose the bottom PCI Express slot, which is actually probably either this one or this one. You lose this one. So if you install an NVMe drive here, you lose this slot completely. So this and this share, but only if an NVMe drive is installed. If you were to install a second Crucial MX300 here, then you would follow the table and you would lose SATA port 3, which is the top port. It's this one down here on the bottom. This is SATA. It's actually labeled on the board. I had to look for it a second. So if you install a SATA SSD, you lose this port. If you install NVMe, you lose this. Now what this says is that you can install anything you want in the top one and you lose no ports. Each board's different. I've seen boards where if you put two SATA SSDs in both of these, you lose half your SATA ports. So consult your manual. When choosing a motherboard to buy, this might be something you want to look at if you're going to actually use all of your ports. Most people probably don't, but if you do need all of your ports, consult your manual before buying one. You can see all of the motherboard manuals on the manufacturer's site. In fact, if you go to MSI and you look up the X370 Gaming Pro Carbon, under document under support is the manual. You can download the PDF of this in every manual. ASRock, ASUS, Gigabyte, MSI all provide their manuals online. You might want to check the manual out before you buy the board to make sure it's going to work for you. I now have the 3 SATA drives in the back installed into these 3 ports. Why these 3 ports? I chose the bottom port of the top one here because the graphics card is going to go here and it puts this furthest away from the graphics card. And then I'm using these 2. You might wonder, why am I not using these 2? Well, first of all, using these 2 just puts more cables in the way to access my bottom connectors on the board. It leaves this a little bit less cluttered. The other reason is I don't want to put anything if I can avoid it into SATA port 3. Remember the manual? This, if I ever in the future say, hey, I want another solid state drive, but I found a really good deal on an M.2 SATA drive and I want to install it. If I have one of the drives in the back installed in that port, I can't. By not using that port until the last, then I save myself the option of just dropping an M2 in here without having to reconfigure anything. Now I am going to deal with these cables, managing them in a second, but first we need to undo this bundle. This has all the front panel connectors, the LED light connectors, power, etc. And just one further point to prove that I'm a human being, I need another power connector, and the reason is there are 2 different SATA power connectors required to drive all the LEDs and other items on the case, so we need to plug those in. Okay, here we are after a very long cut and more than 5 minutes of playing around with cables. I have the HD audio cable plugged in the front. I've got the power LEDs and the power switch plugged in right here. It is worth noting this case does not have a reset switch, which actually quite surprised me, but it doesn't. I looked and I kept looking for the cable and it's not there. So we in fact don't have a reset switch and we don't have a hard drive activity light, at least not to plug in there. Now I do have the cables plugged in here. I have the front panel USB 3 ports plugged in here. Yes, I'm aware this is a bit of a mess at the moment. I've been debating as to what to do with this. The 3 front fans are currently plugged into the 3 fans on the headers on the board. Yes, that can be done differently and there's different headers to use. Another 15 minutes or maybe 20 minutes of cable management would do better here. If I took the panel off of the back, again, and then rerouted these and ran them differently and tied them up. Once I figured out how much space I needed, a lot of this could be wrapped up and stuck through the grommets underneath. I'm not going to do it here for the video because, well, frankly, I've spent long enough on this as it is, but keep in mind that if you're going to do this, you do have the option of cleaning that up. Once I'm finished with the build, which we're almost done, I may, when the camera's off, actually go and clean this up for the final beauty RGB shots, but for now I'm just going to leave that as is. I took my RAM out to install the power cable, so we are going to reinsert that, making sure to use the 2 recommended slots. RAM goes in just like so. Now it's time to install our graphics card, but before we do that, we need to run one more power cable through here. I've got the 8+6 pin power connector here. This end runs, there we go, into the power supply. And then on this end, we have our 6+8, and then we have our 6+8. Now we're only going to use one of these for our GTX 1060, but if you choose to build the $1,600 version that I showed in part 2, or you simply choose to upgrade the graphics card, this power cable will run that For the Win GTX 1080 that I showed you in part 2 of the video with the dual 8-pin connectors. Now, of course, there are other cables we can add. In fact, this power supply comes with 3 of these. You could install another graphics card that uses 2 each, but we're not doing that today. The next thing we need to do with the power cable installed is we need to take 2 of these off for our video card. Once you have removed these 2 panels right here and the screws, make sure that you push down the retention bracket. Most of the modern boards have this design right here. When you push it down like this, it will automatically pop up when you install the card. Simply take the card, line up the golden fingers with the PCI Express slot. It goes straight down. It snaps right into place just like that. Make sure to screw it in. Once our video card is secured in, make sure to plug in your 8-pin PCI Express power connector. And there you have it, the system build is complete. Normally I would stick the cover on, but it's glass and it would just reflect into the camera, so I'm going to leave it as is. CPU installed with the Wraithspire cooler, our RGB RAM is installed, video card, motherboard, M.2 SSD, the 2 SSDs in the back, not really part of the build, but I put them anyway. The hard drive is back there, our 850 watt power supply, all the fans are plugged in. Now at this point, all that's left to do is to put the panels on, apply power to it, and turn it on. And here we are finally back to where we started with the completed build running on the desk. So that was a detailed look of the actual build process. Of course, if you choose a different case or a different motherboard, it's going to be a little bit different. However, the same basic procedures, the same basic workflow stays the same. Take your time, double check everything, don't use a lot of force, and if you have any problems with it when it turns on, go back and double check all of your connections. The astute among you might have noticed something. The power switch to this case was actually plugged into the wrong 2 pins on the motherboard. Because I was building upside down, I was on top of it, I was looking at the manual and I actually plugged it into the wrong row of pins. So when I put it on the desk here and turned it on, it didn't turn on, nothing happened. Double checked the manual, went, oh, I did it backwards. Moved it to the bottom row of pins, pressed the button, turned on perfectly. It happens to all of us. So take your time, double check your connections, and if anything goes wrong, go back to the beginning and double check everything that is plugged in correctly. It may be something as simple as that. Like this video if you like it, share it with your friends if you loved it. Remember to subscribe to my channel with that big huge red button directly below the video. Questions and comments below the video. As always, check out the links in the video description. Full playlist, Amazon and Newegg links are down there. I greatly appreciate it. Furthermore, if you like this video series, please consider supporting me on Patreon. My Patreon link will be down at the bottom of the video description. I buy most of the stuff I review. It is true that Corsair was kind enough. They sent me the case, the RAM, and the power supply. But everything else in the system I actually had to buy myself, even the CPU. AMD does sample me on some of the CPUs. They sent me the 1600X. They did not send me this 1600. This is a retail processor. So the processor, the video card, the motherboard, everything else in here that I bought myself. I try to do that as much as possible because A, it lets me test stuff that I actually like, B, it lets me find the best deals, and C, it lets me provide unbiased reviews to you. So if you're able to provide $1, $5, or more, it is greatly appreciated. Every dollar raised through Patreon goes directly to buying more stuff for the channel, every single penny. So thank you very much. I will see you in the next video.